Hello, everyone. Welcome to InfoSec Leadership Interviews by InfoSec Relations. I'm Samarpita, volunteer host for today's session. Professionally, I'm a data practitioner, and what puts me into conversations like this is how security leaders make hard calls when the information in front of them is incomplete and sometimes even inaccurate. So today's guest has done exactly that from different angles of the table than almost anyone. So Joe Sullivan started out as a federal prosecutor working cybercrime cases. He then crossed over to lead security as chief security officer at some of the world's biggest companies, including Meta, Uber, and Cloudflare. So today, Joe advises companies and boards on how to handle security risks and the hard calls that comes with it. Please welcome Joe Sullivan. Joe, thank you so much for making time. Welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So there's a lot in your background our audience has been waiting to get into. So I would like to first give you the floor. Please could you take us back from where you are now and compare to how you actually got started in security?
Yeah, it's funny, I didn't go to school for cybersecurity because there were no classes on cybersecurity back then. I got into cybersecurity because I was curious about technology and the impact on humans. And it's one of the things I love about cybersecurity is that so many of the people in this profession come at it from that angle. We're technologists, we have to be because we're dealing with ever-changing uh, environments driven by the pace of change in technology. But we come at it from a particular angle, which is how do we make sure that human beings don't get hurt by technology? And
Hmm.
that's what wakes us up every day and gets us excited about work. We get to play with technology. We have to be innovative to do our job. But at the end of the day, we're very mission-oriented people because we care about protecting others.
Right. Right. So before we dig in, a quick note on how today's session would run. So we'll cover majorly three things. The first being attribution, which would be figuring out who was actually behind an attack. Then it would be active defense on whether a company that's been hit can actually push back and how far. And the last would be then legal line, where pushing back turns into a legal risk for the company and sometimes also for the person who made the call. Right? So Joe here has a deep experience across all these three. So that's our ground today. Now, Joe, I'll take you straight to the questions that we have for you today. So, attribution and practice to begin with. When has knowing who was behind an attack actually changed a defensive decision you made?
Oh, it's happened a lot of times. And yeah, it's really interesting, this concept of attribution and how we think about it in cybersecurity. I Every time I see the topic of attribution come up in one of my CISO Slack groups or something like that, it's a very polarizing topic. Uh, if you come from a background like I did, which was first as a prosecutor, you think about who's on the other side. Like when I was
Mm.
working for the government, I would go to companies and say, tell us about your cybersecurity problems. Or they would come to us and they would say, we don't know, somebody hacked us, please do something about it. And we would investigate. And, you know, when the FBI is doing an investigation, their focus is on one thing: who did it, right? Like every mystery story we've ever read about a private eye or an investigator or somebody in law enforcement, all of them are who's responsible for the crime. And so like that's what I came into cybersecurity from the world of law enforcement. And so I automatically,
Mm.
when I look at a cybersecurity problem, one of the questions I ask is who's on the other side. Some of my colleagues who don't come from that background, who came from a pure technology standpoint, sometimes when they look at a cybersecurity problem, they just think about how can I use technology to stop this problem from happening to my company? And like that makes
Mm.
both angles make sense. But when our job is inside the company, uh, we don't really get to think very often about attribution because it's our job to prevent the company from getting hurt by anyone. And so uh, there's a little bit of a bias against investing resources and trying to figure out who's on the other side because we have finite resources, and I'd rather spend my resources on continuing to shore up my defenses. So it's a lot shaped by kind of your background and experience when you get to the role, how you think about attribution. And then a lot also depends on the type of company you work with and the patterns of attacks you face. When I was at Facebook, actually, let me take you back. When I was at eBay, so when I left the federal government, the first company I went to work at was eBay. And I was overseeing a team that was responsible for fighting fraud. And we would do a lot to stop the attacks of fraud. We would train our users to not fall for phishing, and we would put in all kinds of automated defenses to figure out when an account was being taken over. We'd look for fraudulent listings. We would use all the data that we had access to try and model and predict risk. But at the end of that wasn't enough. And so I ended up spending a lot of time on attribution when I was at eBay. And one of the things we figured out was that a large percentage of the attackers back in that period, 2003 to 2006, when I was deeply involved in that, a lot of the attackers were coming from one country. And it was because, one little organized criminal group had figured out how to commit fraud on eBay in that country. And they got really good at it, and they were making lots of money. And then their friends started doing it. And so I ended up traveling between 2004 and 2008. I ended up going to that country 7 times. And I went to that country to train the police on this pattern of fraud and abuse that we were seeing at eBay. After I trained the police, then they said, can you come train the prosecutors? And then we trained the judges and kept going back and doing more of it and it was because we realized that we couldn't stop the fraud attacks just by sitting and using technology at eBay headquarters. We had to create an environment where people were worried that they would get in trouble with the law. I mean, it's the reason why we have police in general and why we have rule of law, and is that we want to have people worried that if they break the law, there'll be consequences. And so attribution was a necessary part of that. And the thing that eBay showed me was that in the world of law enforcement before, and I apologize, it's a little bit of a long answer, but in the world before the internet, most of the data that the police needed to do their job was easily accessible to them. Now, all of the data that law enforcement needs is in the hands of the private companies. So like we all know, like we see the attacks, we know the IP addresses, we know the originating machines. Sometimes we could invest and get attribution if we wanted to inside the company. And it's only if we do that and share it with law enforcement that there will be that kind of risk to the attackers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, changing to that, then most companies will never actually run a full threat intel program, right? So, just to get a bit more practical here, for a mid-sized company with no threat intel budget, what is the minimum attribution work that is still worth doing?
Yeah, it's, I part of what I do with my security consulting business is help lots of different companies think about how much they should invest in security. And one of the things that you see over and over again, and I hate to say this, is that companies invest the bare minimum in security. If you give the CEO of a country the equivalent of $100 and say you can spend it on anything, they're going to spend it on first building a product, and then they're going to spend it on a sales team so that they can get revenue. And then as revenue comes in, they're going to keep iterating on the product. They spend the least amount possible on the costs of doing business, whether it's hiring lawyers or hiring finance people or physical security or cybersecurity. Those teams always get what they need to do their job and not a penny more, because when you give money to the security team, your revenue doesn't grow. They give money to the security team so that something catastrophic doesn't happen, and then, the company goes out of business. So it's something where we've struggled as an industry to articulate the best case for getting the most revenue, the most money for our security teams. Sometimes when you're a small company, if you have a particular risk profile, it makes sense to invest in threat intelligence. If you're in financial services, for example, you're just going to be under attack all the time because there's money to be made by stealing from you. And so you have to, it's more than if you're a company that have, just sells software and is not involved in financial services. And so we see different industries developing. Financial services companies are much more likely to invest in threat intelligence because of that. Um, but if you're a small, medium-sized business, I don't think you should be investing a lot in threat intelligence. You should primarily focus on getting your foundations in place. You know, the defensive things, your IT security, your identity and access management, your device management, your cloud security. Like, you got to do those things first. And so small companies, it's almost kind of like you have to invest a certain amount in prevention before you start investing in detection. And then after you've built out detection, attribution is kind of a subset of your detection function. And only the most mature organizations really invest a lot in those areas.
So we would definitely jump into active defense of this, but I just have to ask one quick question then in this scenario, because AI is pretty much everywhere now, right? So does AI actually make attribution any easier because there is like more signal to work with, or harder because anyone can now copy like another actor's clothing?
I think that in the short term, we haven't seen a lot of changes and impact on detection or attribution. But in the long term, AI is going to help us a lot. You know, if we take security work and we put it into two buckets, say, half the work is the prevention and half the work is detection and attribution, just like for a hypothetical. What is AI really good at? Finding a needle in the haystack, getting through a large volume of data much more quickly than a human ever could. What is detection and attribution all about? Finding needles in haystacks. I am starting to, I work part-time at a venture capital firm, investing in cybersecurity startups, helping them with their investing strategy. And one of the things that I am seeing now are some really interesting threat intelligence startups that are using AI. Um, Partially, they're using AI to analyze data that already existed that we just were never good at. But partially, they're also using agents, AI agents, to go out on the internet, pose as victims, pose as other bad guys at a scale that, human teams could not do before. So we can actually go out and engage in the dark web and send agents to do that. And, that's stuff that humans just didn't have the bandwidth and the patience and the resources to do until now. So I am optimistic about how detection and attribution is going to go in the future.
Right. Great. So from there, moving now to active defense and the legal line, right? So once we know who's behind an attack, the next question then would be what you're actually allowed to do about it. So the White House has floated giving defenders more room to strike back, right? So where is this line between active defense and something you would have prosecuted as a crime?
Yes, this is a really interesting question. It comes up every few years. I think out of frustration that, you know, we haven't, like, if we step back, the reality is collectively, we're not doing enough in the world of cybersecurity. Too many attacks happen. Too many people get hurt. Too many companies suffer from ransomware. The bad guys are getting away with way too much. And so out of frustration, you know, comes like, okay, what are all the things we could do? And one of the things we could do is empower companies because they do have some resources. And sometimes, when you keep getting punched in the face, it feels good to punch back, right? And so companies that have a lot of resources do ask for the permission to do more offensively. Uh, where you draw the line on that, like, is a decision that I don't know. I guess it should be made by people in the government. Like, companies shouldn't be making that decision on their own. Um, there have been, but like, to step back, there have been lots of companies that have done lots of interesting things that could be categorized as kind of punching back. Microsoft, for example, has a very long history of filing civil lawsuits against attackers. And they've done a lot of coordinated takedowns where they have disrupted infrastructure that had been compromised by bad guys. And I think they do very carefully. I've never worked in Microsoft, but I've talked to lots of people as they've done those things. They have lawyers sitting next to their investigators and engineers, making sure that they don't cross the lines, and they figure out how aggressive can we be, and then they stop and they won't go across the line. Some companies, I've heard lots of stories of companies going across the line and doing things. Uh, and there are things you can do that are perfectly legal, that aren't crossing any lines. One of the times when I was at Meta back when it was called Facebook, we were under an attack, and we realized that the domain that the attackers were using, the registration had expired. So we registered the domain and took it over ourselves. And then we were able to intercept the attack traffic and help protect ourselves and see that a bunch of our other companies were attacked, and we're able to notify those companies about the compromises. So there are little steps you can take that are, we don't have to be 100% passive and just be like, I'm just playing defense. I'm blocking goals. I'm blocking your goals, but there are things we can do already, as Microsoft has shown, and lots of other companies. If somebody sets up a phishing site, if it's at bulletproof hosting, I've seen companies dump lots of fake usernames and passwords in there just to kind of create too much noise for the bad guys. There are lots of things that companies can do, short of full hackback, so to speak. I think that most companies, even if they were given permission to fully go on offense, would be uncomfortable doing so. There are a lot of risks that come with going on full offense. One is that you just don't understand fully the environment and the impact of what you're doing. I give you the example of companies stuffing phishing sites. What if the phishing site is hosted by a large ISP, and you decide to, if you put 5,000 username and passwords in it, it might just make a bunch of noise for the bad guys. But what if you tried to jam 1 million usernames and passwords in the next 5 minutes? You might take an ISP offline, and a bunch of regular people who are hosting through that ISP have their businesses disrupted. So, the internet is a very connected and interdependent world. And so we have to be pretty thoughtful before we allow people to go on offense.
Right. So from there, then let's talk a little bit about who holds the exposure on this. So that line isn't only a policy question from what we learned, right? It can also land on a person. So when a company actually crosses it, who carries the legal exposure in this, the company or the individual who actually made the call?
Yeah, I think that's a hard one. And that's what governments around the world are deciding right now. There have been these trends where corporations were held liable for a lot of things, and then governments realized that employees at companies are making bad decisions because there's no personal consequences. So we've seen enforcement actions like the one the government in the United States brought against me, and some other ones where they want to hold individuals accountable. And we're seeing some laws starting to come onto the books around the world, not just in the United States. Lots of other countries are moving in the direction of holding individuals accountable. If you're going to hold individuals accountable, ideally we start at the CEO, and that's the person who ultimately should be making the strategic decisions for the company on these things. Security leaders should never operate in a vacuum. They should always be coordinating with their board and their CEO on anything that gets into this whole category.
Right. So on paper, that's the line of legal exposure, right? But in the room, and during like a live incident, it gets more messier. In the first hours of a breach, when let's say legal, PR, and the technical team all pull different ways, what does a CISO anchor do then?
Well, I think that the CISO is a technical and operational leader in the company. They're thinking about technical risk and operational risk, and they control operational teams. That it's funny, after my case, I had lots of security leaders say to me, Joe, do you think I need to go to law school and learn the legal side of things? And my answer is always no. That's a different functions job. It, we should always have legal folks, the legal team in the room during all these conversations. And we should never uh, be, we should never be saying, oh, legal said do A and we're going to do B. Like, that's not the way we operate in security. We're experts on the technology. We're not experts on the law. And so we need to have good lawyers who have the best interests of all of us in the company in the room with us. And they should be the ones saying, okay, where the gray lines are from a technology standpoint. We know where the gray lines are from a legal standpoint. We also know, what's clearly across the line, and they should be explaining all those things. And then the company should be making a strategic decision. Look, CEOs make decisions all day long to take risks. That's what they do. Any new startup that comes along wouldn't exist if it wasn't led by people who are comfortable trying to do something that no one else has succeeded at before, which means that they're risk takers. But they succeed when they figure out the right line and they take risks, but they also figure out how to remediate them. And then those companies succeed. Security leaders, that's not what we're trained on. That's not what we're good at. So we have to be focused on really understanding what our role is, and then making sure that the legal team and the CEO and everybody else involved is on the right side of the law.
Right. So from what you're sharing, because it has to go through the boardroom, a lot of that comes down to who's in those rooms and who's on the hook once the decision is made, right? But before an incident happens, what has to be settled then between, let's say, the CISO, the general counsel, and the CEO?
Yeah, I think one of the things we should be doing as security leaders is getting our organizations to think through these types of hard situations before you're in the crisis moment. Nope, performs well under pressure. Trust isn't built then. Trust is built ahead of an incident. And so a lot of times when I work with security leaders, I suggest that they do tabletop exercises with their CEO and their lawyers. They should be talking through, how would we operate if a ransomware happens? Whose job is it to decide whether to pay? How much should we invest in attribution? What is our philosophy as a company about transparency? Companies have a real choice on how transparent they are. And I've seen that working at a lot of different companies. Like, I don't get to decide how transparent my company is, but I can encourage conversation, and we'll have a much healthier conversation about transparency if we have it before the crisis moment. We need to set our values North Star ahead of those times. So for example, the last company that I worked at, Cloudflare, had a very, very strong culture of transparency. Like, every time there was any kind of incident or outage at the company, we would put up a very technical, detailed blog post explaining what happened. And that was the culture at the company when I got there. And I remember the first major security incident that I was dealing with. I called my CEO and I said, hey, we're dealing with this crisis situation. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's how bad it is. We think we've stopped the bleeding. I explained it to him. And the second question he asked me was, who's writing the blog post? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not thinking about a blog post. I'm thinking about stopping the bleeding so the company's okay. But he was already thinking about transparency because that was the culture of the company. And he was setting the tone from the top as the CEO. And then he made the CTO join the incident and write the blog post because I was too busy to do it. So by the next morning, we had an article out published on our website explaining exactly the incident that we went through. And that came from a tone from the top. That's the CEO setting the tone about transparency in the middle of a crisis situation, because he'd been through this and he had a plan and he knew how we were going to handle these situations. And I just think that's the way we want to be.
Yeah. So thank you. That gives so much clarity on how it's settled before it actually happens. Now, shifting our focus slightly to then state anchors and the blurred threads, right? So accountability kind of gets harder when the actor might be a government. So how should a company act on a nation state suspicion it can't confirm, but can't also say publicly?
Yeah, I am. I'm a big fan of public-private partnerships and companies building relationships with law enforcement. Most companies in the United States now, bigger ones, as part of their incident response plan, already have written in who in law enforcement they would contact. And they've already discussed with the company what are the types of situations will escalate to law enforcement. I'm putting aside, do we have a legal obligation? That's legal's decision. But there are lots of other situations where you see something and you need to have a philosophy on, should we raise our hand? I think that it's in
Mm.
our best interest if we, as a community of security people, bias towards sharing information. Um, I've seen so many security incidents where one company experienced an attack, and then the next week, one of their competitors experienced the attack. Like, I'll give you an example. When I was at Cloudflare, one of our best products was our DDoS mitigation product. And so if anybody was under attack from a distributed denial of service attack, they would, they would call us and we would get Cloudflare in front and then the problem would go away. And I saw this pattern happen where like the DDoS ransomware attackers, they would target one company in a vertical in a category of vertical. So say like video conference recording companies. They use a particular type of technology for transmitting video over the internet. And the attackers figured out, oh, I know how to compromise, like I know how to mess up their traffic. And so first they go after Zoom, and then they go after Teams, and then they go after, and they try and hold them ransom. And so they work their way through. Now, if the first company, Zoom, sees these attackers and says, "Oh, yeah, they've looked at the way video traffic goes over the internet and they figured out how to disrupt it and hold us ransom, but we solved it." If they keep it in a vacuum and they don't tell anybody else, the attackers are just going to keep working their way through and target all their competitors next. But if they share the information about the attack and how you could defend yourself, then the whole industry benefits. And it's an
Mm.
interesting question. Companies don't want to be transparent about those situations because they don't want to show they're vulnerable to attack. But they would benefit if they felt like me being transparent leads to other companies being transparent with me so that I will get information and I'll be in a better place, then they would be more likely to be transparent.
Right. Right. So, from what you shared earlier as well, that connects these dots, I think often the defender can't even tell which kind of actor they're facing, right? And criminal crews and state linked groups now share tools, infrastructure, and the same access brokers. So when you can't actually tell whether it's a crime or a statecraft, how should that change what you do?
Look, it goes back to that initial topic of attribution. Like our
Mm.
number one job in security is to try and prevent any harm to our company and our customers. And so,
Okay.
um, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter who's attacking us as long as we can figure out how to stop it. It's
Mhm.
once sometimes we stop it and then they iterate and then we have to stop them again and then they iterate and we have to stop them again. When we're under that type of continued repetitive attack where we just get the sense that like they're never going away, if we just keep playing defense and
Mm.
and you- then I think it's time to start thinking about sharing information with law enforcement. It's time to start thinking about sharing information with competitors and kind of come up with a collective defense approach and try and disrupt the attackers. So I do think that no matter what size you are at a certain point, it does help to start working with others on defense. Like you said, the bad guys have no trouble sharing information and approaches with each
Mm.
other. And so the good guys need to get comfortable sharing with each other more as well.
Right. So then I would like to add one more question to it. Like, what is something about defending a large platform then that outsiders consistently don't get?
Right. It is specifically that thing that you kind of asked about,
Okay.
you get attackers who have thought about your platform. So I think there's like a couple of different types of attacks that happen that we have to defend against. There are the random ones. There are a lot of attacks on the internet, or they're just like the bad guys are doing spray and pray. So okay, they try and send phishing emails to like thousands and thousands of people, and they'll see who falls for it. But then there are other attackers who say, I'm going to go after Facebook. I'm going to go try and target that
Mhm.
platform because if I can steal a bunch of advertisers' accounts, I can drain their banks. Or I'm going to go after Facebook because if I can create a bunch of accounts, then I can influence how people think about an issue that's important to me. I can cause violence. If I can compromise a bunch of Facebook accounts and get a community riled up to attack their neighbor, that like people that like you can't do that randomly. You have to target a platform. And so when you work at a large co- company like a Facebook or an Uber, you're dealing with attackers who are very focused on your platform and they figured out how to make money off of it. And they're never going to go away unless you build your defenses so well that it's economically better for them to go target somebody else. Or they're afraid of getting arrested. So then they go pick on someone else. And so it's a different kind of defensive mentality is you're not just dealing with random attacks. And so it's not just about like getting your foundations in place. It's about really understanding the attacker and thinking about them. And in those cases, you need our custom threat intelligence that really helps you as a company.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So shifting now to your personal perspectives, what your restrictions would be, and talking about liabilities. So given everything you have navigated yourself, having spoken about attributions and legal exposures and what your threats, I want to ask this one very directly. So what has shifted about your personal liability that you wish every CISO would understand before they actually face it?
Well, I think fundamentally expectations of cybersecurity people have changed in the last few years. Cybersecurity used to be a team that never had an audience with the CEO or the board, but the world changed. It changed for a couple of different reasons. I think the two biggest ones are pretty obvious. One is the emergence of ransomware, and the second is the emergence of AI. Taking them each at a time. Number one, ransomware. It's fundamentally changed the impact of a cybersecurity incident. Cybersecurity incidents 10 years ago, by and large, were about data leaving the building. Companies, when Target announced they got hacked, it wasn't that our systems were offline and that we can't operate the business. It was our customers' data was stolen. Now with ransomware, it's very much our systems are offline, customers are suffering. We can't, Colonial Pipeline, people in the United States could not buy gas for their cars. uh, Marks and Spencer or Jaguar Land Rover, you couldn't buy a car. You couldn't shop at the store. The supply chain got impacted. People went out of business because they couldn't sell their parts to Jaguar Land Rover. Like the economic impact of cybersecurity is much more than it was a decade ago. There are examples of one-offs, Saudi Aramco or Sony or a couple of, there are a few destructive attacks from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but not anything like what we see now. So that's number one. Ransomware has us talking about operational resilience as a core part of our job now. Then the second thing is
Mhm.
AI. AI is giving attackers the ability to move at a much faster pace, which means we as defenders have to move at a much faster pace. And the fact that we have top government officials freaking out about who has access to Mythos, who doesn't have access to Mythos, and how do we get it in the hands of our defenders? Like CEOs are getting called to Washington, D.C. to talk about cybersecurity. because of the risks that AI is introducing. And so if you're a CEO in 2026, you have to have a personal relationship with your head of information security. You have to trust that person. You have to have visibility into how they're running their function. It used to be the CEO only wanted to look over the shoulder of the chief revenue officer because it's all about the money. But now they need to look over the shoulder of the security leader. And that's a pretty uncomfortable thing for the security leader who's, 10 years ago, you got to toil in obscurity, but now you have to be in briefing the CEO regularly. So the job has changed.
So now that you're advising companies and boards, right, for around the security risks and everything, what is that first question that you would actually want them asking their security leader in these sort of scenario, having these threats that have cropped up?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I want them to push the security team to be more self-critical. I feel like in cybersecurity, we have accepted a level of security that's not good enough. And I think that it's because we never got enough resources to do it well at most companies. That's one of the things that I'll be honest about. When I go into lots of different companies, I only see them investing the minimum. It's a rare company that goes above and beyond on cybersecurity. I get to work with a few of those and I love it because it's awesome to go to a place and see where security has actually won the arguments. But in too many places, security was told, you're the Department of No, you can only have this much money. And so security leaders have gotten used to living with not enough resources. And so what too many of them think is I've done the best I can with the money I was given and the people I have. And so like they're saying in their head, they're like, I'm doing a good job. You gave me this much money and you gave me this many people and I'm getting a lot out of them. So I'm doing a good job. But that's not actually, that doesn't mean the company's secure. And so like there's a difference between doing a job with a limited set of resources and being secure. And I think we need boards to really push on that and say like, saying you're not secure is not saying you're not doing a good job. And we as security leaders have to get comfortable with like, you know, like I think of it as like a menu approach. You say, look, you gave me $100. I can build, I've built these many things. If you gave me 100 more, this is what else I would, you gave me 100 more, I would do this. If you gave me 100 more, I would do that. And this is what I need to get to world class. And I don't think we have that honest conversation enough.
Right. So that also means like pushing more for the scope then, like compared to what other companies and the boards currently have, right?
Right. It's, we know what good looks like. We know what world class looks like,
Right.
but we don't hold ourselves to that standard. We hold ourselves to, this is the best I could do with the resources and the company risk profile that I inherited.
Right. Yeah. So as we wrap up, I think there's one thing that I would like to genuinely ask about security professionals. So what is that one thing that most CISOs and senior security leaders still consistently get wrong?
Yeah, I think it's hiring. You know, we have set up a bunch of compliance frameworks and we have set up a bunch of verticals within security. And so we think in terms of those verticals. When I go into security organizations, what I see often is that the biggest risks are the gaps between the teams that they set up. Like if you take an example of a type of cybersecurity risk that came along in the last 5 years, uh, in the United States, we've been talking a lot about North Korean IT workers who have infiltrated and are working as employees. So people from North Korea getting jobs at US tech companies and other kinds of companies as remote workers, and then using their access to steal data or things like that. Nobody talked about that as a risk. And it could have been people from anywhere. not just North Korea, but I think because of sanctions and things like that, there have been a lot of these people from North Korea doing this. And so for whatever reason, it took like 3 years before any companies captured it, and thousands of these people got hired in. And the main reason, I think, was because no sub-team in security was thinking holistically about risk. And this risk slotted in between any of the existing functions. And so like, if you asked everybody on the security team, are you doing a good job? They all would have said, yes, I'm doing a good job. But holistically, the company was not doing a good job because of the way the team was set up and assigned. And so like, as security leaders, we need to constantly be like stepping back and looking at our teams and saying, are we creating a bunch of silos? Are we empowering people to think holistically about risk? Are we giving them the time and bandwidth to step back and look at risk, or are we just putting everybody on hamster wheels? And so it's like, okay, I've dealt with all the, endpoint security alerts. My job is done. Oh, I've reconfigured all the firewalls. My job is done. Like if people are just in narrow lanes, they're not thinking holistically about risk, and the world is too dynamic and changing too fast. We have to have people who are thinking about the big picture in our teams.
So I think from what you're saying, from a data perspective, it's also about analyzing points of compromise. Hey, that makes so much sense. So Joe, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for sharing your experience. At the end, please could you share with us where can people find and follow your work?
Sure. Yeah. My website is joesullivansecurity.com. I also run a nonprofit helping kids in Ukraine called ukrainefriends.org. And I'm on all the social platforms too, like everybody these days.
Thank you so much. So to our listeners, if this was useful, please follow InfoSec Relations and share it with someone in your network who would actually get value from this one. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Awesome.
Awesome.